If there is any issue with my connectivity and my video is lagging, then I apologize. But in any case, I will mostly be presenting. Um, it's I mean, I remember now how difficult it is to follow Professor Bhatt and his presentation. If it wasn't clear from the introduction, I was his student in law school. So it's very glad, it's a very good experience for me to be here to follow up his presentation. And it's also a presentation I learned a lot of things from. And I'll do my best to follow things up. But as I mentioned in some of the things in my intro session a few days ago, I'll follow up on the ethical aspects of digital media research in today's presentation. And if it's okay, I'll try sharing my screen now. Everyone can see this. Please feel free to stop me and let me know if there is any issue with the screen sharing. My first presentation was mostly an overview on digital media research, and today's session will focus on the ethical aspects of digital media research. And uh, just a quick reminder, I'm a researcher at the Center for Internet and Society, and a lot of our research is focused on the internet and emerging technology and how it can be regulated to minimize the harms that it can have on society. So, digital media is a core component of all of our research because most of how media is consumed, most of how information is transmitted online happens through some form of media that is digital. The In today's presentation, I'm hoping to also stick to time, unlike my last presentation where I could not do justice to all slides. So hopefully I will be able to cover all of these topics. This is just a list of things that we will be going over in today's presentation. So we can start with the first topic of informed consent. I think the idea of ethics and the definition of ethics is fairly well established both in past sessions during this FDP and also in Professor Sairam Bhatt's very good presentation the past session. But one component that I'd like to focus on today is on informed consent, which is a prerequisite, I believe, to any kind of ethical research practice. So, as people in the FDP, as faculty members who either supervise research or undertake research themselves on digital media issues, I think informed consent is one core component that must be paid attention to. And it's also a good starting point for all the ethical topics that I'll be going over. So, the process through which researchers provide participants with relevant information about a research study is how informed consent is manifested. And the value of informed consent is that it enables participants to make informed decisions about their participation process. So, informed consent essentially goes back, I mean, it can rise out of a principle in contract law where people are agreeing to the same thing with the same definition for as an explanation. So the same thing in the same sense. So when you are conducting research and you are interacting with a participant who might be a research subject, a clear, transparent approach will enable the participant to give you informed consent. So, if they are aware of multiple things about what the research is, what it will involve, and what it is used for, to very broadly categorize them, then they will be capable of making an informed decision, and that is core here. This is true irrespective of whether you're doing research online or offline, whether you're doing research in digital media or any other discipline. But because we are speaking about digital media research, some of the informed consent paradigms that are unique to digital media research, I've listed out here. So one of them is the fact that a lot of research will be focused around online platforms and digital tools. So if you are conducting research that is global in nature, where participants may not be physical subjects that you can easily interact with, if you are conducting research that involves data that you have gathered from digital means, if you have gathered data online from data subjects online, then a sure way of getting informed consent is by utilizing tools that are in place, like electronic signatures and online consent forms. So, electronic signatures are a fairly new development in technology and law, and uh, it they're also they make it easy for this sort of informed consent to be comprehensively given, and they are the equivalent of having a signed consent form that can physically be given by research subjects or physically available. So this is one tool I think would make a lot of sense in investing in and learning to use, and also educating other researchers, students, and data subjects to utilize for digital media research. The second one, and the much more nuanced component of informed consent, is the importance of privacy. So, as Professor Butt mentioned, privacy is a fundamental right. Uh, it has been enshrined in the law recently. And we do have a Data Protection Act now, or a data protection law is being created and developed month by month. But the um, the issue of privacy is more goes more than just a legal requirement. But I'll get to more of these things and how privacy is important for trust later in the presentation. But uh, privacy is a sensitive issue because when you are interacting with a research subject, when you're interacting with a person who is giving you information about themselves for a digital media research study, then you ethically owe them a, uh, uh, a right to privacy and a right to respect their personal data. This includes how the data will be stored, who will have access, measures to ensure confidentiality, and transparency in communicating all of these things to the research subjects. So first, you will have to create a system where you will store data while abiding by ethical principles of privacy. You will have to determine who will have access to the data and other means of protecting the data from being misused or accessed outside of authorization. And then you will have to communicate these things to the research subject while to get their informed consent. And in the cases of longitudinal or long-term ongoing studies, another added, I guess, burden that comes with having to respect privacy ethically is that you will have to share this information multiple times over time based on the data that you have been collecting and updating. And you will also have to give participants the option to withdraw at different points based on their comfort. So, if a data subject uh, does not want to share data with you beyond a certain point, then the onus is on you to make available an option for them to stop sharing data. And this could also mean some amount of data deletion or retention policies, which I'll get to in a bit. But privacy is a core aspect of informed consent. Again, like I mentioned, ongoing communication is again important for informed consent. It is a the fact that you are interacting with a participant for a certain period of time and collecting their information for the sake of research also means that you ethically owe them a some amount of consistent communication and transparency to reassure them at the very least that the data they are giving you is not being misused, and that they can in fact trust you. And I think that lies at the core of informed consent and a lot of ethical principles that we'll be discussing today. So trust, I think, is very important. uh, Ensuring informed consent is sometimes required by regulatory systems. This may not be this may or may not be required by actual legislation and law, but it is true that different research organizations or ethical review boards will require informed consent as a prerequisite for most research projects. But it's also important ethically as researchers to follow and maintain a code of conduct, and it it helps in creating transparency and creating an environment of transparency in the research community, and also the general welfare benefit of protecting the well-being of participants and building their trust. And this can help digital media studies grow and become better as a whole. Now we come to the core aspect of informed consent, which is privacy. Very simply, it refers to the rights of individuals to control access to their personal information and reserve the right to keep different parts of their lives confidential. And privacy is um, it is a as a concept, it has developed rapidly over the recent past, both legally and philosophically, I guess. The enshrinement of the right to privacy in law has helped move developments along and made it a little easier for there to be uniform respect to the right to privacy. But that is only a minimum requirement, and in research projects, uh, if your goals are to truly maintain ethical standards, I think there is a lot more that can be done uh, beyond the minimum requirement. So some of those things are here. Transparency, like I mentioned, is about uh, not just concealing any information, about not just having the intent to reveal everything, but making an active effort to fully communicate the kinds of data that you require, the kinds of data that you are collecting as a process, the ways in which this data will be used, and the goal of your research study completely. So these are things that every participant must know, whether to make the decision of whether they are comfortable with sharing their information for any kind of research study or not. Then the data you collect may or may not be personal data, and if it is in fact personal data, then the onus on safeguarding the collected data is quite high ethically. So you, as researchers, will be responsible for creating security measures to protect the data and protect the privacy of the participants. So this can include employing encryption methods, uh, creating safeguards to prevent unauthorized access. So and also ways in which you store the data itself, like how many copies of the data you make, who you share access, uh, uh, who you share access to the data with. All of these things are very important to keep track of, and also create a system around how these research tasks and research processes will be handled when you're dealing with a participant's data. Uh, then before you collect data, uh, it is also sometimes a good idea and sometimes feasible and recommended to conduct a privacy impact assessment when you are, say, collecting potentially sensitive information about data subjects, then it might make sense to foresee how the data will be used and what things could potentially go wrong from a privacy perspective, and then make safeguards, implement safeguards, and take measures to address those risks before they happen. This, I mean, it's fairly self-explanatory why this can help. This can help with privacy risk incidents it can help prevent privacy risk incidents. It can also create standards that will protect the reputation and the privacy of data subjects, the reputation of the institution and privacy of the data subjects. And it can also build a practice of privacy focused research methods, which will again be received well by data subjects and by the community, and create uh, good standards for the community. So all of these reasons are why privacy impact assessments are particularly uh, useful. Uh, De-identification techniques. This is something tied to data retention policies and the distinction I made about public and private or personal data. Now, sometimes when you collect a lot of data from individuals or groups of people, there are ways in which you can modify the data or remove aspects of the data that are unnecessary to the research, and turn this personal or sensitive data into data that does not tell you who the research subject is. In these cases, if you successfully do this, if you successfully practice this or conduct this de-identification technique, then you are protecting participant privacy, and you are also making it so that if there is a breach of data security, or if there is a vulnerability that is exploited and your data is leaked, no participant will suffer as a result of their personal data no longer being identified with them. So one way of doing this beforehand is collecting data anonymously. So if you can separate categories of different types of data you're collecting, and though this is not possible in all types of research, in the cases where it is possible, if you take the mean values of the overall collected data without associating each data point to each subject, then that is one way of de-identification, uh, carrying out de-identification for your data. The other one is data aggregation, which again is collecting data from a number of research subjects, pooling the data into one, I guess, system, and deleting data that is not necessary, that usually uh, creates elements of personal identification. This will leave you with a lot of data that is purely essential for your research and nothing more. And again, this will help in preventing risks of identification. Now, again, like I mentioned, this is not possible with all kinds of research methods. This may not be feasible in several research projects, but in the cases where it is possible, I think this is something that must be carried out. Data retention is another part of informed consent, or something that will aid with it, where you are essentially declaring how long you are storing specific data, and you are also letting data subjects know that after this period the data will be deleted. And of course it needs to be deleted in a comprehensive manner. It needs to be, all copies need to be deleted. uh, if you're storing data partially, if you're storing de-identified data, then those things need to be disclosed. But data retention policies are also a good idea to prevent problems from occurring in the future, where data you have collected in the past might cause risks. So these are some privacy focused ethical practices that will help with research. Now, So far, informed consent and privacy have been fairly technical aspects. Now we come to some more social aspects of ethics in digital media research. So, one core ethical obligation is the protection of vulnerable populations. So, often digital media research and any research will study communities or individuals who might belong to this category that I am calling vulnerable populations. Uh, this could be because they are because of multiple factors such as age. So, if you are studying or collecting data from a group of people, and some of them or all of them are minors, that is one issue. Cognitive capacity. So, if you are collecting data from people who are either minors or of unsound mind, suffering from different mental issues, or are otherwise incapable of doing things like giving you informed consent, and people who, because of different socio-economic or political conditions, might be particularly vulnerable in society. So when you are studying these communities, these demographics, there is an ethical obligation more so than if you are studying fairly protected or fairly secure populations, where there is a higher standard you have to meet to safeguard the rights, well-being, and dignity of the people you are studying. This is because they often, not always, but often are at an increased risk of harm or potential exploitation. So, how we go about conducting research on these demographics is what I'll cover here. So, uh, the first point is identification of vulnerable groups. So, when before you begin research, before a research project is started, it will definitely help to identify groups that for the specific research project are considered vulnerable demographics. Uh, Again, this may include people who are minors, who are children, people who come from a disadvantaged socioeconomic or political background. This might include people who are suffering from a number of health issues and any other kind of disenfranchisement in society. So, identifying the groups is the first step so that you can take further measures to protect their well-being and their rights and their dignity. Once you have identified them, it would be ideal to, I mean, as always, to get informed consent. But in this case, because some disenfranchised demographics might be incapable of providing informed consent because they are minors, for example, it also makes sense to identify a correct means of obtaining proxy consent. So, this could be either from their legal representatives in the case of minors or people of unsound mind, or it could be from in ways in which you can try to facilitate the help of an intermediary to obtain informed consent from the groups. So, intermediaries that will clearly explain the consequences of your research, clearly explain the process and the methodology that you're conducting, and assuage any concerns of misuse of data. So, and also explain the impact of your research. So, in these cases, it will you can obtain proxy consent, provided this consent is very well documented and, of course, meets other ethical standards. Then there are ethics review boards, which already conduct a lot of things that I'm speaking about. And they are always a good idea to approach for most uh, demographic focused research projects because they usually have a rigorous ethical framework already set up, which they will use to analyze your research methodology and point out issues in your research methodology that you can then fix from an ethical perspective. Finally, it's important to as researchers to also, in addition to having ethical principles, I think it doesn't hurt to also have to extend those principles to moral values and see how your research can actually, if you are conducting research and using data from disenfranchised demographics, then it also helps generally to see how your research can attempt to help these disenfranchised groups and see if your research can bring about any kinds of benefits to them and actively prevent harms from happening to them. So that is another consideration that I think is very important, and it's a point that the research community can use to help a lot of groups. The need for this principle, which I think comes from my last point uh, about benefits and equity, is that an extension of ethical principles generally is for digital media research can be that protecting vulnerable populations and demographics is a fundamental ethical imperative in all kinds of research, not just digital media research. And therefore, it also extends to any research that we as researchers conduct. Uh, and this is because it demonstrates a commitment to principles like justice, fairness, and respect for rights and well-being. And this creates an ethical imperative and raises the standards for our ethical requirements when we are conducting research. And the result of this will be that we will our research will eventually contribute to something that will improve the lives of actual human beings, which is always a good thing for the research community. Then there is the issue of regulatory compliance, which most of the times either deals with private institute regulations or legal regulations. When we are seeking to comply with ethical guidelines that we have framed for research, legal regulations or private institute regulations are always a subset of these ethical guidelines. And an easy way of meeting all legal regulations usually is by strict adherence to ethical guidelines. So if you're already meeting ethical guidelines in most cases, if not all, you will also be complying with legal requirements. So that is another uh, way, and this is particularly true in the case of research conducted on vulnerable populations. Uh, if your research is focused on bringing about some kind of benefit to vulnerable populations, that also helps build a lot of trust between researchers and participants. And it might help in your specific research project for sure, but it will also help improve the reputation of the institute that you're working with. It will also improve the reputation of the research community that you are a part of, and improve relations between the research community and other vulnerable populations. So these are benefits that maintaining this ethical obligation will give, in addition to also increasing the quality and credibility of your research. Finally, focus on higher ethical obligations when dealing with vulnerable populations is also required to protect, prevent instances where these populations could be at risk of exploitation. So it is just another extension of the ethical imperative of commitment to well-being and dignity. But this is also a reason why this specific ethical principle is particularly required. Then we go into the issue, the very popular issue of mis and disinformation. I'm sure both in my overview presentation and in Professor Bhatt's presentation just now, we covered the issue of misinformation, and everyone is familiar with the idea of fake news and it what it is and what it can do. But how do we as researchers address this issue? So some of the ways in which we can address it is I've listed here. Methodological rigor is one way where you increase the quality of your research, you increase the rigor with which you collect data, the rigor with which you frame your methodology, and the rigor with which you scrutinize the data that you are collecting and using to make conclusions. So if you have additional steps in place to identify different things such as biases, uh, identify ways in which you can verify points of data, identify patterns and the reason behind patterns in specific data, then I think those are ways in which you can create methodological rigor and improve the quality of your research findings to effectively prevent misinformation in one way. Uh, Other ways are to do with source verification. So this involves verifying the credibility of your resources, credibility of all your data sources. So if you're collecting data for your research, then implementing different verification techniques to make sure that the data you're collecting is not tampered with, that it's credible and it comes from unbiased, reputable sources. I think that is one other key way of going about digital media research and preventing mis or disinformation. Uh, Another way is reporting and documenting the methods you're using to identify dis or misinformation. And this is only to ensure that all your loopholes in hindsight are identified and can be addressed by other researchers. So if you do end up with findings that may not seem very realistic or may seem problematic, then documenting the misinformation rigor and verification processes that you have implemented will help uh, will can help identify why these problems or lacunae arise in your findings. And finally, uh, other ways in which, like longer term ways in which you can help mitigate misinformation and its bad effects. One active way is ethical communication of research findings. So, being transparent about your findings among all communities and publicizing the findings as well as the different methodologies and research processes you undertook so that you can get helpful feedback and recommendations on how the process can be made better. That is one way. Public education as researchers is something that we can easily contribute to. Raising standards of legitimacy of information across all areas of education is something that we should actively uh, contribute to if we are to deal with misinformation, if one of our goals is to address the problem of misinformation. And collaboration, building partnerships with organizations that are already undertaking mitigation strategies for mis and disinformation, such as fact checking organizations. I think that is one good way. There are two visual slides here, which I'll get back to if we have time at the end, but they are mostly research that I have conducted and ways in which we went about utilizing mitigation techniques for misinformation, but I'll get back to this. Very closely connected to misinformation is also the addressing of bias. Bias is something that exists not only in data sources and data sets that we might peruse for our research, but it's also something that we have to identify within our own communities and our individual selves. Uh, so data bias in research often leads to findings that uh, tilt towards very specific uh, ideologies or specific groups where interests are misrepresented and not proportionally represented to give an accurate picture. So, identifying, acknowledging, and mitigating bias in research processes is one way to ensure that this representation happens accurately. Some of the ways in which this bias can be minimized is by creating standards that um, enable and to some extent enforce in research sampling methods that create that foster representation and diversity among participants. So if your research standards, if the guidelines for your research already are favoring factors such as diversity in age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and other demographics, then it's very unlikely, although not guaranteed, it is still very unlikely that at least from a sampling perspective, your research will still be very biased, and your research findings will be that much freer of bias because you have been undertaking this kind of sampling. Awareness of researcher bias is a little more difficult because it involves self-reflection and conscious efforts to minimize personal beliefs and the influence that they cause. And it's something I believe every researcher struggles with to some extent. But research communities and partner organizations, especially ethics review boards, I think are good tools or resources to try to come to terms with the kinds of biases that each researcher has or each research group has, and address them and take steps to move beyond those research biases. Uh, when we are undertaking diverse sampling, we also have to understand how different factors like race, gender, and socioeconomic status can work together and create intersecting patterns. And that kind of intersectionality, where we are not only looking for samples across different age groups separately and different genders separately, for example, but we are looking at different kinds of intersections also and placing value in each intersection as a unique sample. I think that is a much higher threshold to address bias, but it is also much more valuable because it will give your research findings that much more credibility and that much more diversity in findings. Uh, Finally, going back to some technical aspects, data analysis often has its own biases because tools we use to conduct data analysis often are filled with stereotypes that are reinforced in society, and data analysis tools often replicate those stereotypes. So, always questioning data analysis processes and trying to look for alternate explanations for patterns that data analysis tools give you. I think that is being wary when you're conducting this data analysis is a good way to mitigate bias. Finally, if you're using uh, if you're using tools that perhaps mm, are more advanced and tools like AI or large language models, then I think a lot of these tools replicate existing stereotypes. And I think as researchers, there's also the added onus to um, adopt some amount of cultural sensitivity so that these stereotypes don't automatically get replicated, and that we can add some elements of countering biases ourselves to make sure that our research findings are much more legitimate. So uh, these stereotypes could be language focused, could be focused on cultural nuances, and could be focused on stereotypes built around specific groups. And all of these things should be paid attention to whenever we are arriving at findings. An extension of privacy and data retention, as I spoke about earlier, is the ethical responsibility to manage data properly. So, through your research project and its life cycle. You will be collecting data, you will be storing, processing, analyzing, and sharing data. And while there are some legal requirements, there will be some legal requirements to how you can use data and store it in all of these ways. There are also ethical compliances that you can do to increase the safeguard, increase the safeguards that are placed on the data that you are working with. So the last 3 points are things I've mentioned before: transparency in data practices, which involves clear communication with participants; data security, like encryption and storing securely; anonymization and de-identification, which turns personal data into de-identified public data. But a little more complex things here are principles of data ownership, where if there is clarity on who owns specific data, then and there is clarity among both the researcher and the participants, then that uh, results in more responsible data management, because if you are dealing with data that is owned by someone else, the onus on the methods you follow will be much higher. There is data minimization, which is a very useful and a technique that works out very well in a lot of data collection ways, which simply means do not collect data that you will not absolutely require. So if you are following a more maximalist principle of data collection, where you collect a lot of data because you're unsure if the data will be useful or not, and you don't want to cover all bases, then that can often lead you more subject to vulnerabilities. But if you are very clear about exactly what data you need from all research subjects, then you can employ a minimization strategy where you do not collect data beyond what you need, and you can also quickly delete the data the moment you are done with it. And this eliminates a lot of future problems, and also is in line with a lot of ethical and privacy focused standards. Finally, if you're working with other researchers or other institutions, and you often have to share data, then it's key to develop protocols and standards or guidelines for responsible and ethical sharing of data. Again, there are a lot of organizations that have created global standards on this already, but it is important to formalize them and follow them institutionally, and make sure that all researchers are complying with these data sharing protocols. Uh, Community engagement is another very useful tool when you are grappling with concepts around ethics of research. So it involves partnering with communities who are either involved in the research processes as researchers or participants, and with communities who will be directly possibly affected by your research findings. So I see I only have 3 minutes, so I'll quickly go over this. Inclusive participation uh, means essentially promotion of diversity and similar values, not only in research subjects and samples, but also in the researchers themselves that you are working with, and organizations that you partner with to aid your research. So getting a diverse perspective there is very important. Understanding cultural norms and values of the community that you're conducting research on, or the community you're conducting research within, is also very important, because this kind of understanding can help modify your research methodology to avoid misunderstandings and unintentional harm, and also create more trust, which is generally very important and goes hand in hand with any kind of ethical principles. Collaborative decision making is again very important when you're working with different uh, diverse organizations or communities, and getting community input on the research methodology, getting community input on the goals of your research themselves. I think that can go a long way in helping you conduct more ethical research, not just in the methodology, but in the goals of your research as well. Capacity building is a little more difficult, and it's a little more long term. But if you are conducting research processes that can enable educating or providing more opportunities to the community that you are working with, I think it is also ethically recommended to do this, to try to incorporate this in your research processes and see if that can be a finding in itself. And feedback mechanisms and transparency, I think both are sort of covered by the collaborative decision making bit, which is essentially collecting feedback and responding positively to community feedback. And transparency is communication, which I've dealt with multiple times already. So finally, my recommendations. The focus areas for ethical research should always be focused around trust building, which is inalienable to any kind of ethical research. Should be focused around participant rights and well-being. You should be able to see what the long-term impact of your research is and make sure that your long-term impact is not something that causes harm. So like point two, you examine the contributions and impact of the research and you minimize harm. Finally, your focus area could also be to build collaborations and partnerships between your researchers, between the institution that you're conducting research with, and the research and the community that you're researching on. So I think that those kinds of collaborations can help bring in more diverse research and more effective research, and solve a lot of these problems automatically over a longer term period. Then, of course, the recommendation is to follow data protection and privacy standards, not merely the legal standards, but also ethical standards. Uh, Practice responsible communication, practice informed consent, uh, uh, practice being completely transparent and actively divulging information with your research subjects rather than just doing the bare minimum of communication that is required. Finally, uh, as researchers, I know that the FDP is focused on a new program that is starting, but within digital media research, I think there is a there is a lacuna right now on institutions that are taking on roles of ethical leadership, and I believe that this group could try to do that and focus on ethics in digital media research and sort of pave the way for the research community as a whole, if not just the digital media research community, on how ethical research can be conducted and create standards of professionalism. So I realize it is 6:32. Do we have a few more minutes to go over the disinformation indicators, or should I stop right away?
Please go, sir.
Okay. Uh,
Please go. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is very quickly. This is an organization called the Global Disinformation Index. It is a global body that goes country by country, trying to create an index, a database of disinformation organizations that either do not support disinformation or organizations that perpetuate disinformation and actively publish them. So I worked with this organization through the Center for International Society, and our researchers, we authored a report where we analyzed Indian media groups and Indian traditional and digital media groups. And what I'll go over is not the findings of the report, but the methodology that we followed, which can serve as an example methodology. So, things we looked at when we were trying to determine if there is disinformation risk or not is we looked at the title of an article, the kinds of biases that the title can bring about. If it is a neutral title, or if it is actively tilting towards creating a specific kind of opinion among people. Uh, we looked at the byline and the attribution. We looked at whether the authors of the of the article were given credit, whether the body that is publishing the article is actively following ways in which it gives credit to the authors for the publication, which is again a very important ethical point when we are talking about the research and academia community. The tone of the article, again, what kind of ideological tilt it follows, whether it is fair or unfair. The unfair targeting of groups. This was interesting because it required us reading, I think, hundreds of different articles randomly selected and seeing if groups within the article were being referred to and if multiple sides of the perspective were adequately represented. If this was not the case, then we would mark it low on this category. So groups could be political groups, religious groups, gender-based groups, any kind of socioeconomic difference groups. Then we looked at whether this story was also being reported upon by other news media and whether it was a topical story or if it was something merely put in to drive views, similar to the wardrobe malfunctions bit that Professor Butt mentioned in his article, his presentation. Then we looked at the institution itself and how who owned the news organization, whether it was a publicly traded entity or if it was privately owned, whether they were transparent about how they receive funding, and whether their annual financial reports were publicly available. So all of these things are transparency issues that, if they are transparent about, they inspire trust in the organization and the publisher. And I think among research communities also, being transparent about your funding resources, being transparent about the ownership of research and the identities of the authors is very important. We looked at the content moderation policies and if they had a policy on their error reporting and corrections. So we looked at what standards they had to maintain their content and if they regularly corrected themselves in cases of mistakes. So when reporting is done very quickly, the likelihood of mistakes is higher. So how often did they correct their mistakes? And did they have a publicly available policy indicating that this is the process they follow? Finally, did they have a statement of editorial independence, which would indicate that their content is not influenced by their funding sources? Then we looked at the proper meat and bones of misinformation, where we determined the accuracy of the news stories themselves. We looked at whether the headlines were all clickbait or not. And we looked at the content of the news article itself, whether it reported on facts or if it gave embellishment and opinions. Finally, we looked at whether these things, again, offered corrections or not. This is mostly, and then we adopted all of these things to create some kind of a correlation matrix where we used the three the indicators that we had on content, operations, and context, and we tried to determine how much of each factor, when you are performing well at a certain factor, how well would you perform in other factors as well. And if you're performing particularly badly at a specific factor, then how well would you perform in other factors as well. So as you can see, the intersection of revenue and negative targeting is one important thing, where when you're not particularly transparent about your revenue, we found that article bias and negative targeting of specific groups was also very common in news media organizations that were not transparent about their revenue. Similarly, if an article was very unbiased, or if they had very good, then we found that it also ended up having very accurate headlines and did not indulge in negative targeting of very specific groups. And we also found that news organizations that were doing accurate reporting also ended up having a very stringent model of correcting their uh, reporting from time to time. And these ones were also the ones that usually had a statement of editorial independence. So these are just some correlations. You can find the full report. I can share the full report with uh, Dr. Nirmala and the other coordinators. But yeah, this is mostly the end of my presentation. I think we can go into questions. Thank you again for the extended time.
So when we look at trying to analyze the content that is produced by influencers on social media platforms, these influencers are deliberately making their accounts as public. And also, when they sign up to be members of these social media platforms, they're also agreeing to terms and conditions that a third party would also be reusing the data. So, as a researcher, how can we put this within an ethical framework?
As I understand, your question is focused around how the third party content platforms and the agreement to for your content to be used by a third party is can come under the terms of ethics. Is that your question?
No,
While it can
actually,
be reconciled?
no, actually, the question is that I'm working on trying to analyze the social construct of motherhood on mom blogs on Instagram.
Mhm.
So I need to understand the ethical framework over here, wherein these mom blogs over here, some of them they showcase their children in it who come under the demographics of minors or vulnerable community, and they're
Okay.
also public accounts. So as a researcher, should I be seeking for informed consent over here, or how can I be ethically sensitive in analyzing the entire content that is there, or the text that is there, analyzing the image that is available publicly?
Yes, this is a great question. I think you the question brings up some issues with respect to the platform and the content creators themselves. But as a researcher, I think the ideal step forward is to try to identify where you are getting. I mean, try to identify uh, the subjects in each post that you will be analyzing. If an account is posting videos or content of people who are not the people running the account, then it becomes much more complex. But if you have an account where a couple of users, say a mother or and a child, are the data subjects of that account, then getting them to sign a consent form after explaining your full research process, it would be the most ideal thing. If when you're doing this, you can also offer them different considerations where you can say that the data you collect will be de-identified and you will not link this data in any form in any public or private forum to these specific Instagram accounts, if that is something feasible under your research goals. Uh, Ideally, reaching out to a lot of these content creators, offering them this kind of consent form and the flexibility to give I mean for them to disclose exactly the kind of information that they are comfortable disclosing for the research purposes, and the flexibility for them to also say no. I think this is the ideal way. If you are because of the possibility of different people saying no, I think it's also a good idea to go to broaden your scope and reach out to a lot more of these accounts on different social media platforms, and then see if that can give you better results. What you shouldn't do in this case is uh, use any of this data, even if it is a publicly available Instagram account. You should not do. You should not use that data as a research topic without their consent. That would not be ethically sound. And depending on the jurisdictions that these people are based in,
that might not be legally sound as well.
I have a question. Since this session is on ethics, I have done a research on how politicians tweet, and I have seen that the top 10 followed politicians in India, mostly their tweets are polarized. So, what kind of policy recommendations can I give in my research report when policymakers themselves indulge in polarization? Uh, Polarization, because I'm at a stage
So
where I have to write the policy.
yeah, I think this is a short answer to this is a complex discussion that uh, could fill up an entire event or an FDP like session series by itself. I've worked on some of these projects, and it is quite complex. Microsoft Research, an India-based research community, has done similar research where they have looked at politicians, I think, across the world, and also celebrities and their activities on social media, and they have created a matrix or a database recording this, and they have come up with some findings and recommendations. Maybe that might be something you'll find useful, but purely on from a policy perspective, there are a few things that you should think about, I guess, because there isn't a clear answer to what kind of policy recommendations you can give. Now, the issue is that social media uh, accounts are tools of free speech and expression. And if that is a right that you would like to protect, should there be an additional burden for freedom of speech and expression, curtailing this freedom of speech and expression for elected officials? And if that exists, if there is an additional burden that you want to create, that has to be created by policy and then legitimized by law. Now, what is that burden? That is a legal debate, and again a policy debate. So the first question is, should there be an additional burden on the freedom of speech and expression for elected officials simply because they are elected officials? If we are logically extending it, should that burden exist on all people who control some amount of public power? This would then include not only elected officials, but also bureaucrats. This would include celebrities. This could include any kinds of public figures who are creating polarized things. So this is one way of dealing with it. Another way of dealing with it is purely focusing on it from a content perspective and saying that polarizing content, clearly defining what polarizing content is, which is a very difficult task, clearly defining what polarized content is, and then creating some kind of uh, legal restriction against the posting of polarized content. This would be much easier to enforce if you can come up with these definitions, because what can be done then is creating a obligation on the intermediary platforms to remove such kind of polarized content. Again, it would be easier to enforce, and in some cases it's already being enforced uh, simply by sending a takedown notice to Meta or Twitter to take down these problematic posts. But now the other issue, and the reason why this is complex, is because we are talking about a system where a state makes and enforces laws. And often, if you create a system, if you create legitimacy in curtailing freedom of speech and expression in any state, then the state that is enforcing the laws can, I mean, historically, it has almost always backfired in constitutional democracies where the body in power changes and then begins to use this restriction law, the freedom of speech and expression restriction that is based in law, to curtail dissenting voices. And you can see examples of this across the world. So, policy wise, making any restriction to freedom of expression is like a very sharp double-edged sword. What can help with this is trying to think outside the box and looking at ways in which communities are protected from the effects of polarized speech. And this almost always boils down to some kind of education and reform in education and creating awareness among public. And after doing a lot of research on these issues, I have not found a better answer beyond education and awareness. So that is my attempt to make this really complex issue, explain it in the span of a few minutes. But I'm happy to discuss this off the call if anyone would like to.